Today we're covering contracts, covering specifically the RPA. During the class, if you feel that you need to ask a question, have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, ask any questions that you may have, and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end of the class for questions. And so we will go ahead and get started. Can I get just a thumbs up or somebody off mute yourself to see if, let me know if you can see my screen?
We can see your screen.
You can? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Great.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you so much, Charlene. So the first form here, there's a reason why the disclosure regarding agency relationship is the first form before every single contract, before the listing agreement and the residential purchase agreement. It is disclosing to our client ahead of time, right, prior to signing the contract. So that's why we go right into the disclosure regarding our agency relationship before we even have them sign the contract. And so you'll always see this form first. It goes into detail about seller's agent duties, buyer's agent duties, dual agency, so agent representing both the seller and the buyer. And then it goes into seller and buyer responsibilities. And so this is nicely attached here ahead of time. So you have your client sign that first. Beforehand, we're doing the RPA. I'm going to mark buyer right there. And then the second page here just goes into, excuse me, excuse me, fighting a little cold today. It goes over the civil codes here. It's a very long read, so you can feel free to read it. If it's not, it's just attached for your convenience. Alrighty. So here we have the California Residential Purchase Agreement, the RPA. I'll go into detail about what exactly is needed to be filled out on the form, and then I'll go into a little bit of insight. Again, most of you are in coaching, and so it would depend on if you have strategy issues or questions on composing the offer. Definitely check with the coach, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions here as well. But this is for compliance purposes, what needs to be filled out specifically in the RPA. So simple click here, date prepared, this date of the offer. It's an offer from the buyer. You'd fill out the buyer's name here if there were more than one buyer here. So you could put buyer's information there, property city, county, zip code, and then the APN. Be sure to fill out the APN. As much information as you can put in the offer, the better. Seller's brokerage firm, excuse me, not form. Let's put, it's not double ending, so let's do 123 Realty. And then their license number. Let's put, and in this one, we'll say that they're representing the seller only. And so it's a separate brokerage representing the seller. And then you would put in, let's see, let's see. Put their name and then their license. All right. And then we go down here, our brokerage firm, Keller Williams, and we're representing the buyer only. And then we have, okay. Okay. And then we'll go down here, purchase price, whatever the purchase price is to be. So say here it's 400,000. Close of escrow date here, you can have a 30 days after, say it's after the close of escrow. So you'd put in the dates after acceptance. When you submit the offer, there could be a couple days, maybe even up to a week where there's back and forth countering. So you can submit the offer, receive a counter offer back, and then respond to that counter offer. So it could be a little while longer. And that 30 days starts when the offer is accepted. And the acceptance date is day 0 as far as counting days. And so if you need a specific close date, like right now, what we're working on is offers that are going into contract now, so I'm negotiating an offer right now. Our acceptance date could be today. And so we're pretty close if we're looking at the dates to a 30-day escrow. We're looking at a close date of the 29th. So we don't want it to go any further. So what we're doing here is having the actual close date, not 30 days, because then it's going to roll over into June. If it goes past that, it rolls into the next month. Once it goes into June, if it closes June 1st or 2nd or the start of the month, the buyer then pays the prepaid interest. And so it always, for the buyer's benefit, if they're obtaining a loan, always closing toward at the end of the month or towards the end of the month is better for that buyer because they're not paying all the interest if it rolls into, say, the start of the month, because then they have to bring in more funds to close. And so a situation like that, like for example, if you're writing offers now, if you want to close by the end of the month and the buyer can close by the end of the month and the lender has indicated that yes, we're good to close by that date, you can put the date in here. Or if not, you can put, 21 day or 30-day close here. Okay. Expiration of offer. You can leave it blank. It automatically defaults to 3 calendar days, and then the offer expires after those calendar dates. Now, what you can do is in a scenario where maybe you've shown properties to your client over the weekend and they really love these two properties and they don't want to write multiple offers, and send them out. So they say, look, first offer, we love your house, your first pick. However, we need to know sooner rather than later because we're also interested in another property. And so we need to know by today, at 3 p.m. if you're going to move forward with our offer or not. If not, then we're going to go to the next offer. And so that offer will expire after that time frame. So in a case like that, you can use it. I've used it before when the market is really hot and I send in a really aggressive offer for my client. They really want it. And I don't want that listing agent to get all the other offers in from the open house over the weekend, take a look, have us compete with other offers. So I have put an expiration date and say, look, you have by the end of the day to get back to us because our offer is great and we don't want to go into, highest best or counter offer type situation. And so I will put a expiration date there. If not, if it's just a standard, you're making an offer for your buyer, you can leave it blank and it's normally kind of customary that this is not filled out. Okay. Initial deposit here, EMD, I like to put 1% here. 1%'s customary. Anything more than that, up to 2 to 3%, shows that the buyers are that much more interested. First of all, they have the cash to put the down payment, and that amount, if buyer defaulted, could potentially be up for grabs, meaning that if they breached contract or if they didn't perform, the seller could potentially keep that earnest money deposit. And so even if there is a dispute, that amount of money could be held up potentially. So, the more, the higher risk, obviously. And then the less amount of the earnest money deposit, it doesn't look great for the buyers. If there's, say, $1,000, doesn't give the seller a great feeling that if there's only $1,000 to lose, if there's two identical offers, if you're looking at exactly, similar price, terms, etc., and then there's $1,000 deposit versus a $10,000 earnest money deposit, it looks like when you compare the two that the buyer with the higher earnest money is more invested. So, but there's not a minimum amount that is required for that. There's not a maximum either. So 1% is kind of a good middle area. All righty. We don't typically use increased deposit. We can, but then there's a increased deposit addendum that'll be attached, but it's not really normal that we do use this. Okay, loan amount. FHA loan amount is a down payment of 3.5%. So if we were looking at a house at 400,000 and 3.5%, our loan amount is going to be 386,500. And that's not, did I do that right? Hold on. Oh, there's no 500. All right, there we go. 96.5%. So the first loan is going to be 96.5% of the purchase price if it is a FHA. If it is a conventional loan, you would put the whatever the loan amount right here would be. If it's 20% down or 5% down, then the loan amount is you deduct that percentage. So it would be 20% of 400,000. Okay, if it is FHA or VA, you would need to mark this here because the FVAC and HID for FHA is going to be attached. It automatically attaches over, and we'll get to that after the end of the RPA. So that amount is located here. If they were paying any fees, any points to buy down the interest rate, you can add that in here. If the rate does not exceed it, this is for a buyer who might be very, very ratio tight. So if they are really tight on payment and they're buying down rate and they cannot purchase the home unless they get this rate, it's real contingent on that, then you can add it in there. Aside from that, you can leave this blank. Eunice, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa. So I had a question regarding this point, and my question was, do I need to write anything on this percentage? Meaning that you just mentioned whether if it was going to be a tight payment or anything like that from the buyer, but would it be healthy or wise enough to write down a percentage? Say, for example, I wouldn't want the buyer to go above 7%. Is
Okay.
that fair enough to say, or is it only because if it's tight, or can I? What other ways is it
So
possible to write this down?
yeah, so what I would do, check with the lender, right? So let's see if it's at 6%, and then the max they have is 2 points to buy down the rate to get it to 6%, and that's all they can do. This adds in an extra contingency terms in favor of your buyer, meaning if they cannot get that rate, and with the points to be bought down, because maybe over here we're going to ask for a seller credit here to buy down the rate, right? If they can't get to it, it's letting the seller know that, hey, this is a contingency and it's contingent on getting this rate. So it's an extra layer of protection for the buyer to let the listing agent, let the seller know that this is what we need to get. Did
Got
that
it.
answer
Thank
your
you.
question?
Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. Okay. All right. So this, along with this portion here, if it's FHA or VA, deliver a list of lender required pairs within 17 days. So that's automatically, it'll, lender, if it's a FHA or a VA type loan, there are additional lender overlays, additional lender type requirements that are needed. So VA, they could, if they do the appraisal, they could potentially have some things that there are called out. Or if it's VA, they definitely require a Section 1 clearance, meaning it's free of dry rot, termites, active infestation. And so this just adds this here, letting the listing agent and the seller know that it is FHA or VA financing. So there are additional stipulations here. So they know that going into it. Okay. E2, additional amount financed. If there was a second mortgage, there's typically not. So we don't really use this unless there's a second, or maybe the seller's carrying the note. If there is and there's something creative, contact me first and let me know, and I can help you structure this because it does get a little bit tricky when the seller is carrying a portion of the note. Okay. This tiny little box here, occupancy type, be sure to check it if it's an investment property or if it's maybe a second home. If not, if it's just an owner occupied property, then you leave it blank. Okay. All right. So going on, any questions from the first page? All right, going on to page 2. And I was mentioning here when I was talking to Eunice, seller to credit buyer if there is a seller credit needed. So say the buyer needs a credit of $10,000, it automatically puts in for closing costs. This could cover closing costs, or like I mentioned before, the interest rate buy down. If they needed to use some of that additional credit to buy the rate down, they could do that here. Additional seller credit terms does not include broker compensation. This is typically used if maybe in MLS it's noted that the seller is going to pay for a, $5,000 credit. If they opt in, if they say that they're going and outside of this contract, if they say that they're going to provide something, this is usually where we would add that in. So it's not always common, but that's a place where it can be added in there. Okay, now this one here, seller to compensate buyer's broker, and then you would put your percentage in here, whatever it has on your BRBC, 3%, 2.5%, whatever is listed here. Now be sure on your BRBC, if you say you check out the listing, you talk to the listing agent, they said yes, they're very motivated. They're going to pay, an additional $5,000, credit amount if you bring a buyer in the first week. I was talking to an agent, I think last week about that. Be sure that the BRBC is covered. It covers that amount because you won't get any additional amount. So if you had 2% on your BRBC, and then you put 3% here because you've had discussions with the listing agent and the seller about adding additional amount. When you're talking about terms, you won't get that amount. That amount will go to the buyer. So just be sure that the BRBC and whatever you have here matches. It can be less than, it can't be more than. If you've talked to the listing agent, they say, look, I'm getting 2%, seller's not going to pay that, so we're going to counter you out. You can adjust this amount here and you can do a modification of terms on your BRBC, but it just can't be over. Okay. Most of these are automatically filled out here. So there's already a template in, 3 days for all of these, 5, 17 days. We'll go through all of them. But they're already basically filled out. So you can leave them as is, or depending on the type of the offer and how you're structuring the overall offer, they can be changed. These are cash, down payment, closing costs, all within 3 days. This here is if you have a pre-qual, pre-approval, or fully underwritten pre-approval. I wrote an offer yesterday and they have a fully underwritten pre-approval because we went into contract on another property before and it didn't work out. So we have a buyer now with a fully underwritten pre-approval, same purchase price. All we need is the appraisal basically and property condition. So it's not a pre-approval, it's been underwritten. So that's where that would be marked here. A pre-qual, here's the difference between a pre-qual and a pre-approval. Pre-qual is when the lender maybe chats with the buyer and says, okay, yes, I've been working for the state for, 17 years. Here's my income. They pull credit score looks good. Based on the information that they provided, everything looks good. That's a pre-qual. Okay, they're like, yep, I could do this loan all day long. They have a state job, they're W-2'd, everything looks good, perfect, right? That's a pre-qual. Now, pre-approval is when they go over here and say, okay, great, now provide me your pay stubs, all your information, and then maybe you get in the pre-approval and they're like, oh, actually you have, an extra amount of debt here, and you provided these 2 years of pay stubs. However, why is last year significantly less? Oh, I was on disability for half of the year. Okay, that's what a pre-approval is. A pre-approval is collecting all the information, not just pre-qualing based on information the client provided. So be sure when you are showing a buyer property, the difference between a pre-qual and a pre-approval versus a fully underwritten pre-approval. And when I do have that fully underwritten pre-approval as opposed to a pre-approval, I always let the listing agent know that, hey, it's fully underwritten, meaning we've already jumped through all the hurdles. Underwriters already had their eyes on it. We've already addressed everything. So it's just basically up to property condition is what we're looking at to get the deal done. Okay, now we're moving in here. These are the final verification. So your final walkthrough, 5 days prior to close of escrow. If you need to do it sooner or perhaps later, you can mark that here. Let's see, contingencies. Okay, so here is the important part here. This is where all the deals are good when we negotiate up front, and so this is the area where the deal can go in a different direction. So loan contingency defaulted to 17 days, same with appraisal and investigation of the property, insurance, review of seller docs, prelim, disclosures if there's a HOA, if there's lien or leased items, if there's solar, etc. And then if it was contingent on the sale of buyer's property, then you would mark that here. So here's all the contingencies automatically defaulted to 17 days to make your offer stronger. You can shorten the contingencies. If you have a fully underwritten pre-approval, you could shorten it here, 10-day. 17 days is standard, especially with the 30-day escrow, which is standard. We're seeing a lot of that. There were shortened time periods, but now we're kind of getting back to the more traditional switching over to a buyer's market. When it is a seller's market, these are short or waived. Okay, so on a seller's market, the buyer's like, get me in, no loan contingency, no appraisal. I just want it. Here's my firstborn, whatever you want, right? It's shifting now. The market is in the middle of a shift. It's technically on paper not already there, but it is feeling definitely like a buyer's market, not a seller's market. But in a more traditional balanced market, 30-day escrow and 17 days are normal. Okay. This here, contingency, full contingency removal, please do not do this. So do not remove and waive all the contingencies up front for your buyer. It's even to be strong and aggressive, even if they're cash, it really puts you at risk and it puts the client at risk too. If you're going to shorten it, say, hey, give me 5 days. Give me 5 days to investigate the property. Let me do my walkthrough. But removing them up front is very risky. I'll touch on this too. When you have a listing, and if you get this from a buyer that they're removing all contingencies up front, so they marked it, what you need to do up front is provide them the transfer disclosure statement from the seller and all documents attached to it. So provide the seller disclosures, because this isn't a real contingency removal unless they've reviewed transfer disclosure statement and all documents attached beforehand. So just be kind of aware of that. If you are accepting an offer, it's not a real full contingency removal unless they've reviewed the TDS ahead of time. So keep that in mind. Okay, sale of buyer's property. If it was contingent on this buyer has a house listed and they need the funds for the sale of that property to put as a down payment on this one, then you would mark that form box right here. It's kind of hidden away here, so sometimes I've had it happen to me on a listing where I had a discussion with the agent and then it's not marked. So just be sure to mark that. It's kind of hidden there. Okay, time of possession. Standard is upon recording. So once the property records, it is now ownership has officially transferred. It is now the buyer's property, no longer the seller's property. If they need, by 6 p.m. to get out on the date of close of escrow, you can add that in there. It's not unusual for that to happen. They might need a little bit of time. Or if they're like, hey, we'll be out by, 10 a.m. Okay. But notice of recording is just standard. Now, if the seller needs some of the rent back to stay in possession, if they need, say over the weekend, so say it's a 3-day, seller to stay in possession 3 days after close of escrow, a seller in possession form gets attached to this. Now, the tricky thing is, and this will happen, and this is not uncommon, but if it is over 30 days, then it creates tenancy. So 3 days, seller in possession is they're providing the buyer is now the legal owner, and they're providing the seller a license to stay in the property. So there's no tenancy created. It's very similar to when you rent a hall or you rent something or an Airbnb. It's a license to stay there. They don't have tenant rights or occupancy. If you go into 30 days or more, then it's tenancy. So just be aware of that and be careful about that, and let your client know that yes, they're landlords. 30 days or more, they become landlord. The seller now has tenant rights. So anything less than that is a license. More than that's creating tenancy. Okay, occupied properties. If you're purchasing a multi-unit or a single family and investment property, if there is a tenant there, tenant occupied property, the TOPA form would need to be attached there. Okay, seller delivery documents. Seller has a week to deliver the documents to you. If they do not in the 7 days and say they deliver it day 17, you now have additional 5 days to review the documents before your contingencies are removed. And so just be sure and on the listing side that you're providing those disclosures within the timeframes, and so you don't run into a problem with extending that contingency period because of lack of providing the documents in timeframe. Okay. Any questions regarding this page with all contingencies and all these additional forms? Okay. All right, moving right along. So items included and excluded in the sale. Typically, stove and oven. Refrigerator is not typical to stay unless requested. So it's not attached to the property. And so if it's not indicated in here that the buyer wants it to stay, it doesn't necessarily stay. So anything that's attached, built-in stove, oven, those remain. And dishwasher, built-in microwave, I always mark everything there that's going to be included. If there were any additional items that they want to be included, it would be here. So let's see. How about oh, I think it's here. Let's see. The EV charging is a big one recently. So the EV charging systems, if they want them to stay. If there was an above ground pool or a spa. So anything here or anything excluded if they want the play set in the backyard. You want that gone, you would exclude it from the sale here. Okay, now we're going down to allocation costs and who is paying for what. So customary that the seller pays for the NHD report. I like to put, go ahead, Eunice.
So, before we continue, are there any specific um, things that can be excluded, or there's no like limit or
Yeah, so you mean give me an example of something you'd want to exclude from the contract.
so for example, this buyer, she was like, well, I don't, if I take off the carpet, I don't want to have the carpet because, so would that count as excluded? And would she be able to require that from the sellers, or is it something specific with like, is
Yes.
there like a rule or anything like that to have it
No,
excluded or included or
no. So if she wants the carpet removed from the property, I would probably put it, I'd probably put it, let me see here, other terms. So seller to remove carpet in uh living room prior to COE. Yeah. So I would add it there.
got it?
Yeah. So any additional terms, yeah, good, that's a good example of something that would be in additional terms down here, other terms. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you wanted, it would, the excluded items are more for items that are questionable, like a shed, right? A shed in the back. So it looks movable, but it might be on a, kind of bolted in a little bit. So it's kind of uncertain and maybe they don't want it to stay because it's all rusted. Or maybe they do want it to stay. Maybe the shed, it's uncertain if the shed is going to stay. So shed they want it to be included. Or maybe they do want the play set in the backyard to be included. And then you could, mark that here.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Going down here to allocation of costs and who pays for what. Okay. NHD report, it's standard that the seller does pay for the NHD report. The reason why it is required by law that the seller, regardless of if it's in a trust or if it's owned as a corporation, even the exempt sellers that are exempt from some of the traditional disclosures are not exempt from providing a natural hazard disclosure. The report shows everything about the property that you could need to know. the tax area, and if there's any natural hazards in the area, if it's an earthquake, fire zone, etc. And so seller has to provide that, which is why we request that the seller pay for it. It's not, seller doesn't have to pay for it, but they have to provide it. So it's just an easy way to have the seller provide what they need to provide anyways. Okay. If there were a wildfire disclosure report, if it was needed, add it there. Additional reports, termite report, and let's see, we're going to have the buyer pay for it and a roof report. Let's say we want to add those in here. You don't necessarily, when I add the termite report in here, I always add it when I have a VA client. So that lets, even if the buyer's paying for it, I let the seller know that, hey, we are obtaining a termite report because it is VA. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. It's standard that the seller does take care of all that. Again, they can counter it back. They don't necessarily have to, but it is it's customary that the seller would cover that. Going down here to escrow fee, customary each to pay their own, and you could put seller's choice here. Same thing with title company. Each to pay their own, and it is seller's choice. The reason that it's more convenient for seller's choice is when you take the listing, when there is a listing, typically there's a lot of work done up front from the title company. And so they've, got the preliminary title report. They've probably ordered a payoff demand from the lender, provided an estimated seller's net sheet. So there's a lot of upfront work that's already been done on the property. So it just makes it a lot easier. And it's kind of a courtesy to the seller, to the listing agent, that they just use the title company that they've chosen. You don't have to, but then again, this is just a customary way to do it. Lenders and title insurance policy, the buyer pay for that unless otherwise agreed on. Buyer pays for their title insurance policy, insuring buyer's lender. Okay. County transfer tax, seller, city transfer tax. Be sure that the city that you have, there aren't any cities in San Joaquin County or Stanislaus County that require a city, or that have a city transfer tax. Same thing with Sacramento County. But if you're going out of those areas, confirm to see if there are city transfer tax. County transfer tax, customary that the seller does pay for that. Okay, HOA transfer fees. That is, if there is a transfer fee, some require it and some do not. So just depending on the association, if there is even an HOA transfer fee. And then here, HOA fee for preparing disclosures, the seller automatically pays that, and then the buyer pays for the certification fee of the HOA docs being drawn. Okay, private transfer fee, we don't typically use that. If there are other fees or costs. So you could put anything else kind of miscellaneous in here. Home warranty, I always recommend getting a home warranty. It makes it so much easier after you close escrow, and say if the garage door isn't working, or the dishwasher, or there's something here, you can automatically default over and say, hey, call your home warranty company. Here's the information. And then this can vary too. So this is kind of depends on the offer. There's no really right way to do it. It depends on the area, and just the overall offer, of who pays for what. You can have the buyer pay for it if, maybe you're going in below list price and asking for a lot of things on the offer. Maybe like, what, buyer, yes, you want to get a home warranty. You can cover the cost, or you can say, what, seller, I gave you a full price offer, short close of escrow, it's conventional, 20% down, easy to close, throw in the home warranty. So either way, you can add additional things in here. So say there's a pool, and then the AC, because those are additional costs. They're not the standard. So you can add that in here. And other terms, Eunice gave us a great great example here, seller to remove carpet in the living room prior to close of escrow. If there were any other terms here, you can add it here. Another big one, seller to pay off solar at COE. They'll indicate that sometimes in MLS that the solar is going to be paid off. And so just I double check MLS and see if there's any additional notes or confidential agent remarks of anything here, and that can go into this box here. Okay. Any questions yet? All right. Moving right along. Now, all of this here, if there were any additional, when I was going through and marking and clicking some of the things, if there were anything additional that we missed, we can add it here. If it were probate, you can click that there. If it is a manufactured home or mobile home, you can mark that there. We don't do a lot of the tenancy in common. It's not typical there. Tenancy in common is when perhaps you're purchasing a property that has divided ownership. And so it could be, a building with multiple units, and tenancy in common is each owns a certain percentage of it. So you're not selling the entire property. It's just a ownership a portion. That's what tenancy would be used. Go ahead, Eunice.
So as you're going through this example, would it be like a halfplex, for example?
For the tenancy in common.
Yeah.
So I'll give an example. So in San Diego, there are tons of properties that are in specific areas. So we have a lot in La Jolla area. So in La Jolla, there's condos that are, $2 million condos and their own tenancy in common, meaning that you can purchase, and they're on the market, they're listed, you can purchase a portion of the tenancy. So it's not the entire building. It can be owned by, it's either a vacation rental or it's owned by someone, but you're just purchasing into that particular, think of it more of like an investment or a portion of the ownership, not so much just the sale of that particular property. Okay, tenancy in common, stock co-op, we don't use a lot of that, or the mixed use property purchase agreement. We don't use a lot of that. The main one that we would do is the TOPA or the probate. Other addendum, if there were any attached here. Septic well monument propane addendum. Short sale addendum, we're seeing a lot more short sales. So that would be attached. Be sure that if it is a distressed property or a short sale, that you do attach that. Real quick, I'll touch on this briefly since we're talking about short sales. Yes, definitely be sure to include, if it is a short sale addendum. If it is a foreclosure or if it's a notice of default, you have to use a different purchase agreement. You cannot use a standard residential purchase agreement. You have to use the NOD RPA. So it's an entirely different contract because there's language in there that lets the buyer know that the seller could potentially not close. This contract, the way that the RPA is written, there is essentially no way that the seller can get out of the contract. Seller is agreeing, period. They sign on the line, they agree to pay. Buyer can perform their due diligence within the contingency period, and their consummation of the offer is based on those contingencies. Seller doesn't have one, right? Unless it's a contingent upfront on maybe on them finding a replacement property. On the NOD RPA, they have a contingency because they might not be able to sell and it's not essentially going to be their fault. So it's letting the buyer know ahead of time that this is potentially could foreclose in the middle of going into contract. So different contract needs to be done. And the same thing if it's a short sale addendum will need to be attached here.
I have a quick question.
Sure. Yep.
So I actually closed on a property a while ago, and we were not aware or even told that it was going into foreclosure. We recorded like 36 minutes before it was going on the auction block, and we never were told throughout the whole transaction.
Yeah, they need to. They were supposed to. They
So
were
they're
required
supposed
to.
to yeah, they're supposed to disclose. Are they supposed to disclose it right away when you send in the
Yes.
RPA? Okay.
Yes. They
Okay.
they should have disclosed, first of all, they should have disclosed it up front. I'm trying to look for the portion. It might be in the listing agreement. Um, but hold on, let me find it in here. So yes, they're required, and if it goes into default, they have to let the seller is required to let the agent know because there's no way the agent knows. If it's not recorded, so if they're just in default, there's really not a way unless the listing agent is, looking to see if it's on public record,
Right.
the listing agent's not going to know. The seller is required, and I'll try and find the language. The seller's required to update the listing agent and all parties if anything changes. Um,
Okay. I
it
did go
might,
in with an RPA.
yes. So it should, so if it was, let me see if I can find the language. It should have, if it was just a standard RPA, then it's fine. If it did happen to go into default while you're in contract, then they do need to disclose it. Let me see if I can find the language. Um, I might need to look for it. But it does specifically state that. Yeah, I'll look for it. But yes, they should have made you aware ahead of time before going to auction because that's a huge issue for the
Yeah,
seller then.
we only found out when we recorded and we closed escrow. Zillow already showed it as a foreclosure when we were already recorded.
Yeah, yeah,
It was
they should
scary.
have notified you ahead of time because it is, but I mean, they got lucky because then what happens is if it forecloses, then, then the buyer's out basically everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And if the seller can't even, if they're not making the payment, there's not really a whole lot to go after them for anyways. And so good thing that it closed and we didn't have to deal with that issue. But yeah, just and there's really no way of again, you wouldn't assume that you wouldn't have to check to see is the seller in default. That's not something standard that the listing agent would check for, and it's not something standard that, a buyer's agent would check for. So yeah, it does fall back to the seller
Okay.
that they are required. I'll try and find the language for you, Charlene. I'll send it to you. But yeah, the seller's required to provide that information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other addendum here, the probate advisory. So the if probate and then the trust advisory too. So probate trust, REO, I'm going to mark all those. So probate trust, REO, there are certain disclosures that are not required to be provided if it's in a trust or if it's sold in an REO. If the trustee has never lived in the property and then they really don't know, they can't accurately disclose things about the property. So the TDS and the SPQ, they are exempt because they're asking specific, if there's nuisances, well, they don't know, and we can't ask them to be accurate with their information because if they've never lived there, they wouldn't really know, right? And so those are exempt. So it is a good, and it's always good to be kind of a little extra careful when you do have buyers that are purchasing a property that's either an REO or it's in a trust because there is limited information. Again, it's not it's okay to sell a property in a trust, but it just makes sure that when you have the buyer that you do a little bit of extra due diligence because it's not somebody a normal transactional seller who has lived at the property maybe the past 5 years. They know all the ins and outs about the property and they're more than happy and willing to disclose everything. A trust, it could have been vacant for some time and it could have been somebody passed away in the property and it's been sitting in this trust and there's not a whole lot of information known on the property. So these advisories, especially with the REO advisory too, and trust advisory, it protects us by letting the buyer know, hey, there's going to be limited information here and limited liability here if something is not disclosed because there's limited disclosure here. With the REO as well, the bank-owned properties, like I said, we're definitely seeing a lot more of these distressed properties, short sales, foreclosures, the REOs come about they're not required to provide a lot of the information. And so again, just make your clients aware of that. And that's what those disclosures do protect there. Okay, so this goes into definitions, and what I was talking with Charlene a little bit about is this goes into detail about all of the informations that we talked about on the first couple pages of the information that we filled out. And so we're talking about the loans. This goes information about the loans here. Um, Balance of the purchase price, limit on credits to buyer if there's a limit here, right? It talks about the allowable credit. If we put a $20,000 credit, well, there's a max limit, right? So the lender allowable credit, there's a maximum amount there. So this is really good, especially for the newer agents, to go through and read these pages. There's a lot of information, and this goes into detail and clarifies the terms that we've already gone over. It can be deals very easy if it's easy, right? So you click everything, you fill it out, great, it closes, no big deal. But when you have an issue or something more complex, it's always good to remember that there's language and explanation and verbiage here that you can refer back to. Like it talks about a big thing here, the condition of the property at closing. So we get through our initial negotiations, our contingency removals, and then you go and do the walkthrough and you're like, hey, wait a minute, the pool is, green. It was blue when we did it. And, the grass is grown out. And, I had one last week, one of the agents, they were complaining about fingerprints from an inspection. And so this goes into detail about what is required, right? What's required at the close of escrow, what is standard, what is not, who's responsible for what. Um, Seller remaining in possession after the close of escrow. I talked about it a little bit, license versus tenancy or, tenant landlord agreement. Time frame here for contingencies and removal of contingencies. We talk about the buyer's contingency. Notice there's no seller contingency because it's not. So sellers cannot back out of the contract.
So,
Appraisal.
Lisa, I'm in contract right now on a property where there was a death. It was a homicide.
Okay.
Where would they where would they normally, and it's a probate, so where would that normally be disclosed? Because I found out through my discovery, but we had to resend them contracts so that it was noted in the contract. But where would I normally go to see that information on disclosures?
Well, it was noted in the trust.
Uh,
I mean, I'm sorry, not the trust. So it was noted. So it was being sold in a trust, correct?
no, it was just, was it? No, there's no trust.
Okay. So SPQ. So the SPQ, so it would happen in the past 3 years. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay. Yeah. So it's on the SPQ. It's asked if there's a death in the property in the past 3 years. You can mark it there. There's a portion at the bottom that asks if or other known material facts. So say it was 4 years ago, but it was a homicide, and maybe it was in the paper, and maybe it could be considered material. We don't want to leave that up to for us to decide what we think is material and not. So then you would still disclose it anyways. So yeah, the SPQ, it would be listed there. There's the portion for that.
And then on the second, if they sell the property, say 2 years later, do they have to disclose that the prior, that when they moved in, that there was a homicide, or is it just 3 years either way?
It's three. So statute says 3 years. So that's all the requirement. That's the question. So a seller could easily argue and say 3 years. It's past the 3 years. I don't have to disclose. Now a buyer could say, "Hey, I think it's a material fact. Even though it's 5 years ago, I consider that material. So I think you should disclose it." So rule of thumb, if it could be, we don't want to leave it up to us to decide what we think may or may not be material. So let's just disclose it. So I
Okay.
would, if you're thinking about it and you're thinking, should I say this or not? Just say it,
Okay.
because you don't want it to come back and say, well, you knew about it, you had disclosures, it was disclosed to you, and you didn't tell us. And then the seller could say, well, I didn't think it was a material. And they could say, well, it is. And I wouldn't have bought this property had I known there was a homicide, because a homicide is different than a death in the property. So, it's one of those things that's subjective. And so when it goes into that realm of, same thing with it being haunted. Okay, it's haunted. Well, who can prove it? No one. But if you think it is and you've heard it is, well, it's, was there a exorcism, right, on the property?
Right,
Have the
right.
Catholic priest out there, right? So those, when it goes into that weird gray area, just put it down because we don't want, and it says it specifically in the language that listing agents or agents do not get to determine what is material or not.
Okay. And have you ever seen somebody put that the property's haunted, like in the disclosures?
No, I've seen
Okay.
it on MLS. I've never seen it on a disclosure
Okay.
disclosed. Yeah.
All right. Good to know.
Okay. Let's see. Talks about appraisal here and investigation of the property here. And it says here contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition and any other matter affecting the property. So that is our disclosure contingency, our SPQ, our TDS contingency there. Insurance, and these all go back to all of these here, or go back to the second page where it had our contingency dates, where they were the built-in for the 17 days. This goes into everything here, it just goes into more detail about everything. Items included and excluded from the sale if need be. So this is a good one too, because this is a question that comes up. What's included? All existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. Like I mentioned, the shed in the backyard, it's kind of a fixed, but maybe not, and we don't know how bolted it is, so you can put include or exclude. That's one of those because we don't know if they're attached or not. Existing, all of these that are existing, electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, heating fixtures, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs, grates, solar power system, built-in appliances, appliances for which special openings or encasements have been made, curtains, drapery, or shutters that cover any portion of the window, and associated hardware, rods, attached floor coverings, television antennas, satellite dishes. So everything attached is included. If you want something excluded or the seller requires something to be excluded, like maybe a fountain, or I've had often the window coverings, they want them, they're going, they do not convey. So you have to specifically state that if you want it to be excluded from the sale. But this is everything that is automatically included in the sale unless otherwise noted or negotiated. Okay, leased or liened items. This is big on the solar, right? This covers solar. Seller has to provide information within the time frame to disclose to buyer any information on that, copies of the leases, who has the lease, and any other material items that go along with what's included in the lease. Um, Items excluded from sale. Otherwise agreed upon, the following items are excluded, right? So this goes into furniture, other than items secured to the property for earthquake safety purposes. So any personal things like um, there was a house that I showed a client, and they had all of these completely custom furniture that goes around this large island. So the chairs and they want it to stay. So that's something that they can negotiate, but it's not automatically included in that, and it's considered personal property. And we're going to do an addendum for that, kind of on a separate note to negotiate that. So let's see. Um, I'm trying to find. Okay. Another question that gets asked often, and we touched a little bit on this with Charlene's question or discussion about disclosure and what to be disclosed. If the seller or listing agent, they have any past reports, so it could be several years ago, it could be anything that they have on hand has to be disclosed to a future buyer or disclosed and provided to the buyer, anything. So if you had if it was an escrow Buyer sent reports, did a request for repairs, it didn't work out. Those reports now need to go to the other buyer. If I see a property that's online and it says back on the market, no fault to seller, I say, okay, well, where's the inspections? Send me all the inspections because if you're already in contract, then there were probably inspections done. So can you send them over to me? So I always be sure to ask for that because they have to provide them. Sometimes they won't. They need to. They're supposed to. So yeah, so that has to be provided. And then likewise, buyer completing investigations on the property, the buyer has to provide anything, any reports or inspections that we get on this property as well. So it goes both ways. So anything that the listing agent or the seller has on hand has to be disclosed. And the same thing if a buyer obtains any reports, those need to be sent over to the seller as well, to the listing agent as well. Okay, TDS, NHD, and other statutory and supplemental disclosures. It talks in detail here about those important disclosures. Really the main ones are going to be the TDS and the SPQ. Those are our big ones because that's all the information that the seller personally fills out. Everything else is just the template forms, all the standard statutory disclosures that are already filled out and the seller just signs them agreeing to it. But the TDS and the SPQ, the seller actually fills out the forms themselves, and those are questions that they answer. So that is the most important. Anytime there's an issue, a legal issue or dispute, everybody says, send me the TDS, SPQ, and the AVID. So those are the most important forms. They're not going to ask for buyer inspection waiver. They're not going to ask for, they don't ask for these other disclosures. They want the SPQ, TDS, and the AVID. Okay, these go into detail about the different types of disclosures, termination rights here. Tax withholding, Megan's Law. Okay. Known material facts. Seller shall with specified time frame disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, including but not limited to insurance claims, past 5 years, or provide buyer with permission to contact insurer, make any other disclosures required by law. Prelim. Oh, we did have we're about ready to wrap up, but real quickly, we had an issue last week. So buyer indemnity and seller protection for entry upon the property. And so the issue was the buyer shall keep the property free and clear of liens, repair all damages arising from buyer investigations, indemnify and hold seller harmless for all resulting liability, claims, demands, damages, costs. So what happened is the buyer had somebody perform some investigations on the property and they left it dirty. There were handprints and the seller was upset that it wasn't free and clear. So the buyer is supposed to keep the property clear and the buyer is responsible for anybody entering the property. So it was very minimal, but the point is, if it were something major, it's the buyer's responsibility for anybody that goes to the property, whether it's a, photographer or if it is a termite inspector, home inspector, just be sure because as the buyer's agent, you are responsible for whatever the person does on the property, and this is holding the seller harmless.
So just real quick, Lisa, so I know everybody's probably had it happen a couple of times where the pest inspector just goes in and punches holes everywhere.
Mhm.
So in a case like that, you're saying that the buyer has to repair those?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
It is the buyer. It
Okay.
is the buyer at the buyer's direction, and they are holding seller harmless. The seller is not responsible for anything that the buyer's inspectors, agents, etc. does. Yeah, the buyer's liable, not the seller.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.